And now it is my distinct pleasure on behalf of the Harry S. Truman Library Institute to award the Truman Medal for Economic Policy to an American hero, Paul Volcker.
Congratulations. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, Harry Truman, all right.
Let me get my notes out of the way.
Well, thank you, Bill. Members of the Economic Club and Truman Institute, and particularly Tom Honig. Tom, I don't know about this 30 years business. It may seem like a long time to you, but when I left the Federal Reserve, I well remember, I was 60 years old. I felt a kind of feeling of desperation. I thought, my God, I'm 60. People retire at 65, remember? Those days, I got 5 years to kind of make a little money or do something. Why I'm here 23 years later is not quite evident to me. It's a life after 65, so just remember that. You know, this is obviously a great honor to receive the Truman Medal for Economic Policy. It's not only an honor, it provides me with a real opportunity. An opportunity to pay personal tribute to one of America's greatest presidents. In a way, it's a time for some personal repentance. I remember as a young man with my father listening to the radio in the election of 1948. And it got well into the morning, and my father, who was a good staunch Republican, kept listening, and as I recall it, the early reports came in from California, and they said Dewey was going to win California. And my father, who was never wrong, said, that's it, Dewey's going to win, and he went to bed. Well, like a lot of other people, he was surprised the next day. You know, back in those days, 60 more years ago, I was at a couple of universities that I think it's fair to say thought of themselves as leaders in intellectual sophistication and in public policy. I have to tell you, the Truman name at that time was not on it. He was, after all, a man of modest background. He became president by accident in a world in conflict and turmoil. He was thrust into responsibilities seemingly unprepared. Now, at the end of World War II, communism and Russia were certainly threatening. Europe was in shambles. The United States may have won the war, but that didn't mean we were very popular around the world. I can remember my first trip to Europe several years after the end of the war, and there were slogans written all over walls in Europe, Yankee, go home. Not exactly a warm, welcoming atmosphere. Well, in a few short years, we had the Truman Doctrine, we had the Marshall Plan, we had economic stability and price stability restored. We also had a Council of Economic Advisors, as Tom said. We had the national debt under control. Can you imagine that? The Korean War had become an open wound, but I think it's fair to say that President Truman's determination to repel the naked aggression from North Korea set a standard for international affairs. A couple of years ago, I ran into a Harvard professor who told me he polled his undergraduate class regularly with a simple question. The question was, in all the whole world, in the past 100 years, which leaders would you rank as first in constructive influence on global affairs? Much to my surprise at the time, he reported that President Truman appeared on that list, one of only 2 American presidents to be mentioned, and Mr. Truman was ranked number 7 behind such people as Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. Quite company to keep from this simple man from Missouri. Now, I have to tell you, he would not have been on that list in my undergraduate days, quite the contrary. So I am particularly grateful for this chance to atone for that enormous error of judgment about so simple and courageous a man from the state. Now, there's another irony in my presence today. I'm following by a couple of years my successor as Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan. But the simple fact is that President Truman had a rocky relationship with the Federal Reserve. For some years during World War II and thereafter, the Federal Reserve had been maintaining interest rates in a range of 3/8 to 2.5%. They were, in practice, under the thumb of the Treasury. And I must say the Treasury then was in the person of one John Snyder, another Missourian. Subsequently, I actually became a good friend of his. But Mr. Truman liked those interest rates. But as inflation threatened, the Federal Reserve did not. And it became increasingly restless. And eventually, there was a public fight. To put it bluntly, that was one fight that Mr. Truman lost. The independence of the Federal Reserve was affirmed and reinforced, and that I like to think was good for the country. Now, events and maturity have completely changed my view of Harry Truman. He indeed stands as one of our most important presidents with a lasting legacy. I'd like to think that that same Harry Truman, were he with us here today, would have changed his views as well and come to respect the importance of a strong and independent central bank. Now, I'm reinforced in that view with the simple fact that when he left the presidency, he actually occupied an office in the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. So friendship must have been restored. Now, that's all an introduction to the fact that for the first time in decades, the role and independence of the Federal Reserve has again become a matter of political concern and debate. We're still living through a financial debacle. That debacle has been part of, indeed it was a precipitating factor, in a deep and potentially lengthy economic recession. It's been labeled a Great Recession, threatening something much worse. And that threat is not entirely a far-fetched view. It was only enormously forceful and massive intervention in financial markets by the Federal Reserve and by the Treasury that contained the crisis. Each activated long-dormant emergency powers. They generously interpreted their existing authority to the very limits. And in the process, they succeeded in restoring some functioning order to the markets. While the sense of crisis may have been eased, it is true to this day, more than a year after the frantic days of September and October 2008, that the apparent stability of markets is fragile. The flow of credit, incomplete as it is, remains dependent upon Federal Reserve support. Then why is it that a book entitled End the Fed by a long-serving Congressman, Ron Paul, has appeared on the New York Times bestseller list for some weeks? I don't want to give credence to Mr. Paul's more extreme views. But however, there are reasonable questions that deserve convincing answers. One of those questions arises from the unprecedented use of the Federal Reserve's dormant emergency powers that I referred to earlier. That authority was enacted in the dead of the night in 1930 without any legislative history. It has been invoked before now only in extremely limited and I presume experimental ways 80 years ago. The legislative language unusual and exigent circumstances, to quote those 4 words. In those circumstances, the Federal Reserve could lend against any acceptable collateral, pretty broad authority. And that has been broadly interpreted to support loans and guarantees of hundreds of billions of dollars to large financial institutions, to justify the purchase of commercial paper in the market, to support the securitization of mortgages and other loans. All of that is bailouts, to use a colloquial language. Bailouts on a really massive scale. Now, those are interventions that reach far beyond the normal, confined, presumably competitively neutral purchases and sales of government securities and lending to commercial banks against not acceptable collateral, good collateral. Those are things that are a normal part of central banking operations. But now, significant risk of loss is involved, loss ultimately to taxpayers who ordinarily, to the contrary, benefit from positive Federal Reserve earnings. But beyond the financial risk is the more amorphous but significant circumstance that these market interventions inevitably involve difficult judgments about which individual institutions should be saved and which should be left to their fate. Beyond the individual institutions, which sectors of the economy are to be aided? Should those answers be determined by some purely economic criteria, determined by an independent agency, or are they inextricably and legitimately a matter of political interest? Now, I have no doubt that Chairman Bernanke himself and his colleagues are uncomfortable about the position in which events have thrust them. At the same time, the response to those questions seems to me clear. If not the Federal Reserve, then who and how to respond to crisis? What other agency has emergency funds immediately available in the amounts necessary? Which is prepared by financial experience and by professional expertise to act in days or to act literally in hours? To whom else should the Congress entrust such powers and funds on a standby basis? The practicality seems to me that to leave those 1930 emergency provisions in place, but with clear procedural safeguards. Politically responsible officials, the President himself via the Secretary of the Treasury, should certainly be informed and their approval required. That, I feel certain, has been, in fact, the informal practice, and it is worth clarifying and enforcing that practice at this time. Perhaps a reasonable time limit should also be placed on the exercise of the emergency authority. In essence, it seems to me that maintaining the Federal Reserve Authority should be viewed as a necessary, if unpalatable, means of permitting timely and effective response to a really dangerous crisis. But given time, it is true it's an administration and a Congress that should come into agreement about the use of public funds. Now, the second question about the Federal Reserve role in recent events may not be as easily answered. The argument, quite simply, is that however heroic the response to the financial crisis, was the institution sufficiently alert in its regulatory and supervisory role? Should it not have better foreseen and mitigated the financial fragility? For instance, the subprime mortgage phenomenon. Beyond that, were Federal Reserve monetary policies, clearly at the heart of its responsibilities, appropriately disciplined and alert to the potential damage of financial excesses? Now, obviously, those are questions that economists and others will long debate in the academy, in public, and elsewhere. And I would be a biased participant in that debate, but I do want to make a few relevant points. First, that the Federal Reserve's supervisory role was less aggressive and less attentive than subsequent events suggest would have been desirable and necessary. Let's by all means strengthen that function. Ensure it receives the attention it deserves. In my view, one element of that approach could be to designate by law one of the Federal Reserve governors, presumably as a vice chairman, and given responsibility for supervision, should be nominated and confirmed in that position for that responsibility and be accountable directly to the Congress by regular reports and otherwise. I would also note that the Federal Reserve was only one of several financial regulators. In retrospect, fairly or not, the question of supervisory adequacy reaches far beyond the Federal Reserve. In fact, experience repeatedly illustrates that official regulation in the circumstances is an imperfect means of maintaining stability in free and open financial markets. So all of that emphasizes the importance of thoroughgoing structural reform of our financial system. Business as usual simply will not do, however attractive that may be for those Wall Street lions who have become accustomed to huge compensation as a kind of God-given right. I do not have the time, and I'm sure at this point that you will not have the patience for a detailed analysis of needed financial reform. My personal views are on record in other places. I could refer you to the current quarterly review of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis that reviews them rather extensively. And I know closer to home that conference that Tom Honig and the Kansas City Reserve Bank sponsor every year among the lions of private and public finance provides long and sensible debate about those issues. I must say, among all that debate, there is one point upon which I think there is widespread agreement and would represent a new departure in supervision. There is a need for what I think of as a systemic overseer. The point is that some authority beyond the regulator of particular institutions, which is the present pattern, some authority should be responsible for looking over the entire range of financial markets. It should be looking for points of emerging weakness or strain, look toward potential threats, such, for instance, as the sudden rise of the subprime mortgages or the proliferation of speculative use of derivatives, developments that seem to have the potential for threatening the stability of the whole system. That would be a large responsibility. Would require experience and expertise, a highly professional staff, and a degree of independence. Clearly, there's more than one way of developing those needed administrative arrangements, but I do believe that this, too, is an area in which the Federal Reserve would be especially competent and suited. Let me be direct in summarizing my position. You won't be surprised by my view that a strong and independent central bank is a critical institutional arrangement, both for the conduct of monetary policy and for financial supervision. Indeed, I think that conclusion would hold in other countries right around the world. In fact, I believe some responsibility for financial regulation is an important complement to monetary policy. which, when all is said and done, must be conducted through the markets and financial institutions that make up the financial system. If those markets are broken, if they're not operating effectively as at present, then the implementation of monetary policy will be crippled as well. And we can design on paper and we can write laws for arrangements that recognize and facilitate those relationships. But more than paper designs and law are necessary. It is more intangible matters that are the key. Does the central bank maintain an independence? Independence not only from partisan political pressures, but from narrow private influences. Does it have professionalism, a sense of continuity and resourcefulness that commands respect and confidence? If some of that has come into question, let's by all means repair the damage and reform the institution. The other day I came across some words from Tom Hoenig himself, here with us after many long years of service in the Kansas City Fed. And he emphasized the Federal Reserve System, and I quote, was designed to assure broad input to decisions and provide a mechanism to build national policy consensus across broad regional, economic, and cultural differences. And it was designed to be accountable to, and yet independent of the government, assuring trust in the institution. There it is, trust. A simple word, an essential quality that we as citizens have too often lost in our governing institutions, in the Congress, in the bureaucracies, sometimes in an administration. To my mind, that is a grievous loss, a loss since the days of Harry Truman, when by and large government was seen as a constructive part of our society, not as the problem. One thing seems to me absolutely certain. It was government, at the end of the day, had to ride to the rescue of our broken financial markets. That cannot be a permanent solution, however vitally necessary it was at the moment. So let's carry out the needed financial reforms. Let's try to build and rebuild and reinforce institutions that can deserve and justify, once again, our trust in government. Thank you very much for having me today. Godspeed. Thank you.